Welcome to Happy Path Programming. I'm Bruce Eckel.
I'm James Ward.
So this is episode 10 of
Number 10.
It is, of Happy Path Programming. So,
which only matters because we have 10 fingers, right?
Probably something like that, Yeah.
Base 10.
It's a historical thing.
Yeah.
It probably does come down to that. So just kind of along the lines of our theme, our overarching theme, I've been thinking about what the next big jump forward might be, which a lot of times we only see in hindsight, but we can still guess and
look in our crystal ball.
Yeah, to see what is going to make a huge change in programming.
Yeah.
What it's like to, because there are things like you look at the internet and it used to be that we had to wait for books to come out and magazines, and then we'd pore over the articles and understand something new. But if we had a question, boy, sometimes it would take a lot of digging to answer that question. And now we've
going through microfilm and microfiche.
Kind of, things like that, And now we've got...
Do you remember the difference between microfilm and microfiche? Am I saying that right? Microfiche?
Yeah, I do not.
Yeah,
I do not.
I knew it at one point.
Right.
I knew how to use what's the library book lookup system?
Dewey Decimal
System. The Dewey
System.
Decimal System. Yeah. I used to know how to use that. Now.
Yeah, and now it's like, you could probably guess. You could probably recover it somehow in your brain. But there are things that we have now that there are things that I know how to do, but I go, I just need a little reminder, so I'll type it in and look it up, and I was right. And whereas before it was like, no, gotta dig it out of your brain, figure it out from scratch, make sure you remembered it correctly.
Yeah.
But I'm thinking, so the two things that I think could have a big impact are, the first thing is,
are you thinking like 5 years out, 10 years out, like how?
Well, time is hard now because we're talking.
Look at it through.
We're talking about the computer world and how things move forward, and so I guess, and so the first thing that I have thought of is not having to think about efficiency.
Yeah.
And because we do now, and there's a lot of people who get into programming and don't learn about efficiency, probably.
Yeah, when I was learning assembly, we were very concerned with how many ticks on the CPU was this operation. And you're really trying to eke out every last bit of ticking on the CPU you possibly
and memory.
And memory.
Memory was super, I would argue the reason we have variables is because we need to conserve memory.
Yeah.
Whereas if you think of programming, with invariant programming, you go, oh no, I don't reuse this memory, I make something new. Well, that's very wasteful.
Yeah.
But it's very helpful at the same time, Yeah, it's wasteful, but if you have plenty of memory, then conserving memory is a bad use of your time.
Yeah. What's interesting is that what comes to mind is how at some point we decided that we needed to separate our logic from our data. Is that the right way to frame that? I'm trying to remember the exact... we have our program, and us as developers write our programs, but they're abstracted from the actual data that they operate on when we write the program. And what that means is that we as the programmer have to think about how much memory does this thing use, or I think even at some points like how much work is the CPU going to have to do to accomplish this task. So we as the developers are thinking about those things, but we're not actually operating in the context of the data that we're going to be actually dealing with. And so we kind of have to make some assumptions about how big things are going to be or how long they're going to take when we're writing the code, but we're supposed to be abstracted from that data. And so today, just an example is you are operating on a list of things. And you have to make some assumptions about how big that list is. Is it too big for me to fit into what the space that I have available, or is it not? But we're supposed to be abstracted from that, but we're not. Like it's this leaky abstraction where we do have to think about size of the data. And so I think to your point, at some point, hopefully we can program without having to think about those things, and our programs will be able to know how to handle it. So for instance, we'll program in a way they'll say, oh, this is way too much data for me to operate on this one node. I need to now distribute this processing across multiple nodes and do it. But we as a developer shouldn't have to make that decision.
Yeah, Python has generator expressions which look like, for example, you could write a list comprehension and you produce a list all at once, or you could change the square brackets to parentheses and it becomes a generator expression. Everything else is the same, but it's only creating the elements as you need them.
Yeah.
And that feels
it's
a lot.
Kind of the difference between streams and lists.
Yes, exactly. And very much.
Today, you as the developer have to decide, am I going to operate on this thing as a stream, or am I going to operate it on as a list? It's like, why do I have to make that decision? Right.
It seems like the language, I mean, I think if people were thinking about it back then, they would have said, well, why don't we just make, anytime you make a list, we'll make it a generator expression instead of a list. But we had to, like in Python, we had to get to the point of people understanding list comprehensions, which were introduced, I think, only in Python 3, if I remember correctly. And then once you go, oh, list comprehensions, sure. Oh, now we can change that to be a generator expression. So it's been this sort of evolution. And if we were to create a programming language from scratch, we might not say, oh, there are two different things in this case. And I think it's a good example. And I think maybe it even goes back to assembly language, because we clearly had, oh, here's your RAM. Yep. And here's your ROM, and the two had to be different. And now they don't, but we're still carrying the baggage from the thinking that way, because the languages, I don't know if I mentioned it to you, like when Pascal was created, one of the big deals was to design it so that it was a single pass compiler for speed. And so, that changed the way you thought about programming for a thing that we don't think about anymore.
Yeah, and then another dimension of this is time and how long things take. And so today, all the rage is like reactive programming and demarcating asynchronous things. But it's in some ways like something the developer shouldn't have to think about, because you could take every operation and say this is essentially asynchronous. I think what we've done is said, like, okay, if I'm talking to the network, I know that that's going to take a long time, and so that should be asynchronous. But what does that long time mean? Like 100 milliseconds, 10 milliseconds, 50 milliseconds? Why isn't everything that takes 1 millisecond asynchronous? So I think we've essentially made some boundaries around, okay, here's generally how long these things take, and so this is synchronous and this is asynchronous, when we shouldn't have to make those distinctions. Like the underlying processing should be able to handle all these things. And this is where I think like Loom is going with on the JVM, with the bringing back green threads essentially to the JVM and making it so the developer shouldn't have to care.
Yeah, any kind of concurrency is a big burden, because part of the problem is that you have to figure out, not only do I even need to use concurrency here, and sometimes people use it when they don't need it, and then it's what strategy am I going to use to solve this concurrency issue. And all of those things, like if you don't have that issue, you just say, here's what my program should do, and you don't even think about it. Yeah. And that's very liberating. Yeah, concurrency just bogs you down in so many different ways.
Yeah.
So that's one thing I'd like us to not have to. what is it? It's not Elm, but Julia. Yeah, Julia does a lot of things so that the programmer doesn't have to think about concurrency.
Yeah.
And that's
and ultimately concurrency is about resource utilization in that way. And so to your point, I think, like at some point we hopefully will be able to program without thinking about resources.
That's a more general way of putting what I was wanting to say. Yes, not having to think about resources.
Yeah. So resources mostly being CPU and RAM, but there are other things that would probably fall into that bucket.
Well, all kinds of things. I mean, if you look at the way that web systems have changed, I mean, it wasn't that long ago that if you wanted to put up a website and you thought it might go, a lot of people might start using it, you had to build your own server farm. And now, so resources first, and you didn't even know if you were going to be successful.
Yeah.
And now you can put something up there, and if it starts to get successful, it just, acquires more resources as it needs it.
Yeah.
So we're definitely getting closer to that.
Yeah. I think the programming models do have to change to support this.
Absolutely.
Because the programming models we have today, they're so most of them that I work with are so dependent on specific resources, and really propagates that stuff to the developer.
Oh yeah, your thinking is bound by that.
Yeah.
And it could be liberating to not have to think about that.
We do see the places where I've seen programming languages start to step away from this is Unison for sure, and then Pony. We've talked about both of those before, but both of those kind of fundamentally change the programming model in ways that I think step us towards not having to have the propagation of resource constraints to our programs.
Well, and look at garbage collection, which was really, I guess, strongly popular. I mean, Python had it before Java did, and it existed in some other languages, but Java brought it into the mainstream. Before Java, people just said, oh no, garbage collection is too expensive. We could never do that.
Joey from WTF pointed out from one of our previous episodes that we didn't talk about Smalltalk, and Smalltalk as being one of the first places where garbage collection was used. So I'd never used Smalltalk. So
I tried, but it was so expensive to get a Smalltalk system at the time. It was back when you still had to pay for.
People are actually using Smalltalk today for production stuff. I think Squeak is the open source Smalltalk.
Yeah, it's been around for a long time.
And then
I think there might be others.
Web framework on top of Squeak or something. So,
so it's
trying sometime, but
there. And the Japanese language, Ruby. Ruby was influenced by Smalltalk.
Huh.
So there are examples of that.
So back to your point, garbage collectors freed us from having to think about memory allocation and deallocation.
Right.
So that was a good step into moving us away from programming models that propagated resource stuff to the developer.
Right. And we've talked about error handling and the issues around that, and the fact that most people, it's kind of the title of the podcast refers to the fact that most people don't think about errors. They go, it won't happen to me.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so they pretend that error handling isn't an issue. The other thing that I think is going to make an impact is, I don't know if I want to call it, I guess I'd just say machine learning applied to programming. And there's a tool that has been being developed for Python called Sorcery, Sourcery. And you can install, or at least I've got it installed on PyCharm. And then what it'll do is it'll see little pieces of code that you've written, and it goes, there's a better way to do that. And,
cool.
Should I rewrite that for you? And so it's just the very beginning.
Yeah.
But I found not only has it, improved my code in general, but it has introduced some ideas to me that, maybe haven't completely internalized or didn't think about, and I go, oh yeah, I could do it this better way, because it's kind of helping you. It's sort of as if Stack Overflow would be intruding into your programming experience instead of you having to go out and ask Stack Overflow. It's going, here's a thing I can do.
Yeah.
So
I thought about that for refactoring. Refactoring. One reason that we're so held back as programmers is that there's a huge cost to moving onto newer versions of things. So like Scala 3 is going to come out in a little while, and people with large Scala code bases, I think, are going to generally have a hard time migrating to Scala 3. There's going to be code that needs to be rewritten. They've worked on some tooling to help make it easier, but this is, I think, such a great place to apply AI. And I think that we have the training data on GitHub to teach a model how to refactor from one version of whatever to a newer version of whatever. And it'd be really interesting to see, like, could this help us move forward faster with adopting new technology faster?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I can imagine somebody creating a new language along with, and Kotlin has done this a little bit. Like, you can take your Java code and you can put it into IntelliJ and it'll say, it'll rewrite it for you into Kotlin. And I think that's very helpful. But I could see somebody designing a language that with translators.
Yeah.
So you could just say, okay, here's my Java code base, and now I want it in this new language. And think about how much faster that would make adoption.
Yeah.
It would just be like, okay, we can switch to this overnight.
Yeah.
And
even like trivial migrations can be such a challenge sometimes. So in the world of Scala, I've used Play Framework for years and years, and Play Framework has been really bad at just changing things every single major release. And
you mean breaking changes?
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah, API changes, configuration changes, just changes in how you do things. Like, they moved from iterative based streams to an Akka based streams, and just kind of changing paradigms as they evolve, which is great. Like, I want Play to be able, and any framework to be able to evolve, any library to be able to evolve, but it was a huge challenge even to take small code bases and migrate them forward. And I think that what happened was people just generally don't. And so then you've got this huge tail of people on your old stuff not adopting your new stuff. And it's just weird that as a programming community, we haven't really thought through, like, how do we evolve and bring people with us? And I think that AI is probably a key to that. But haven't seen anybody really do much with that idea.
So do you think that, because my impression of Scala is that it's kind of we're doing experiments. We're leading the pack by trying a bunch of things out, and that, other languages, well, certainly Kotlin adopted lots of experiments that Scala did. And so that attitude impacted Play to the point where they're going, yeah, we don't want to feel stuck. We want to do it right.
Yep.
And doing it right means, oh, well, if I made a mistake here, we're going to fix it.
Yeah.
And backwards compatibility,
yeah.
Out the window.
Yeah, I think there is a very heavy cultural value in the Scala community of doing experiments and trying to get it right. And yeah, you're going to make mistakes and you're going to have to fix those. And so, yeah, I think that's why Play Framework differs so much in that way from like Spring Boot and Spring Framework. Like Spring Framework over the last, 10 years has had very few breaking changes to the framework. It's even hard to think of them, whereas with Play, I can think of dozens off the top of my head. And so very different kind of core value between the two communities. And I think where that comes from is that Scala in part comes out of EPFL, where there are doctoral, postdoctoral students that are doing these experiments, trying to find the better solutions. And I really appreciate that there are people doing that, but it definitely leads to a level of churn that can be hard for users to keep up with. And I think that tooling, and maybe AI as part of that tooling, is the way to address that.
Yeah, you have to be, well, either that or just acknowledge that, okay, if you're going to live in this world, it's going to be changing, and that's the world you're signing up for.
Yeah.
And you know, then there's these other worlds that say, I don't want my web framework to be changing constantly. I want to be able to put something up and not worry that it's going to get broken, which is probably a larger portion. But then
that's enterprise.
It's enterprise.
Once enterprise has something working, it's like, okay, don't touch it.
I mean,
keep that mainframe system running for 50 years, whatever.
I mean, there's a bunch of things that I do that's not my main interest. You know, websites, for example. I use static site generators. I use Hugo. And I don't want that to change. I want to be able to do, because it's not my goal to be experimenting with those things. I just want it to work.
How frustrating would it be if you went and like updated Hugo, and then all of a sudden you had to go through all of your past articles in your Hugo site and update them because some API changed. That would be frustrating.
Yeah,
for sure.
I wouldn't.
But tooling could do that for you if there was investment into that tooling.
Yeah, well, I mean, if I had to do something like that, I would write a tool to do it. You know, I don't trust doing things by hand.
If it's toolable.
If it's toolable, well, yeah.
I wrote a tool to help me migrate my WordPress blog to Hugo, and there were so many corner cases. It was just, oh my God. At some point, I was just like, I cannot address all these corner cases, and so there's just going to be some old blog posts about Flex that are not going to be formatted correctly. Oh well.
I'm in the process of taking Thinking in Java, which is a Word document, and turning it into LeanPub format. And there are lots of special cases and things, and I've had some experience with this kind of thing before, but it's actually a really intriguing puzzle, because there are some things that you go, all right, I can't do this, I can't completely automate this thing, so I'm going to use a totally different strategy. And it's been kind of expanding my brain to like tables are a real problem. Some of the tables convert correctly because I'm using Pandoc to go from the Word document to the initial markdown, and then I have to convert that to something that LeanPub will understand. And some of the tables convert, and others of them seem to end up as HTML formatted things. I'm not sure why. And so I finally decided, okay, well, the table thing, I'm just going to create a list of tables and do those by hand and then automatically substitute them. Yeah. And it's kind of an interesting, different strategy to take. And you realize, there's all kinds of approaches. I don't know. It's a messy problem, and yet I'm getting satisfaction out of solving it. So,
nice.
So did you have any other ideas about like what might move us forward?
Yeah,
big time.
I think some of it is like the happy path that we've talked about a lot, like making it easier to program on the happy path, but make that happy path match reality. Mm-hmm. So I definitely agree with you on that one. The other one that comes to mind is that I think that there's a gap between just generally the easy way and the right way. And I think that those things are converging. So just as an example for this, just this morning I was working with somebody on a video where in IntelliJ they want to be able to like click a couple buttons, create a project, click a couple more buttons, have it deploy to Cloud Run. And it's like, oh, that's so easy. But it's totally the wrong way to do things. Mm-hmm. Like if you're doing something real, like you should never do stuff that way. Like you should be setting up a CI/CD pipeline, and you should never be like creating the thing that you deploy on your local machine. You should be having a CI/CD system do that. And so in that scenario, there's a huge gap. And if I think about, okay, if I want to show them the right way, we're talking about like 100 steps versus like 5 steps. And so just in that one example, there's this huge gap between the easy way and the right way. And so part of what I've tried to do in a lot of places is try to bring convergence to those. Make the right way the easy way. And so that's what I did with something called Cloud Run Button. Was Cloud Run Button is not, it is the easy way to get started with a service called Cloud Run, but underneath the covers it's showing you, here's what we did. So it's just automating some steps for you to kind of peel back the curtain on the right way, but not create a whole different way. Is I think where I want to see convergence is, let's make the right way the easy way too.
Yeah, because it really can get very overwhelming fast. Somebody goes, I just want to create a website. And then pretty soon there's all these special cases and corner issues and things that you have to deal with. One of the first things that I did professionally when I was working for companies was I needed to make a floating point math library in the assembly language that we were using for this multimeter. And so I dug in and learned all these things which I cannot remember at this point about, how does floating point math work and what is the IEEE 488 standard or something like that, and created this library. I'm still kind of amazed that I did that. Anyway, so I had in my head, I had all the mechanisms of the low-level stuff that was going on and the efficiencies and everything. And so when I was starting to do more high-level programming, that was still there, and I would look at something and go, well, that wouldn't be efficient. I need to do it this hard way to make it more efficient. And it was a long time before I started realizing that at least some languages, the easy way was the right way. Because, well, even in Python, I would do things where I would write a lot of code because I was thinking, well, this is more efficient. And then I discovered that, no, if you just do it the simple way, it's often faster than doing it the way that is in your head.
Yeah.
And that was very enlightening. Just the beliefs that we have that we know better.
That's right. Yeah. So defining what the right way is can be hard because we may be bringing a lot of baggage with us to define what we think is the right way. So deciding what is the right way is definitely a challenge.
So you mentioned that you were working on a presentation or a...
Yeah, so switching gears if you want to.
Switching gears, yes.
Yeah. Tomorrow I'm doing a presentation about inner source. So inner source is the idea of taking the ideas of open source to corporations or organizations so that you try to create a culture that works like you would in open source but does it for code that's not publicly available. And so I haven't given you any prep on this, so I'm curious, what, off the top of your head, hearing the word inner source, like what would you see as some of the values for bringing what the way that we do things of open source into the kind of corporate world?
Well, I mean, the first thing that pops into my head is, so to give it a little background, I spent a bunch of years studying organizational structures and trying to find better ways to do it. And that's how I ended up finding this book, Reinventing Organizations, which talks about flat organizations and how you would create them. And one of the things that I haven't ever been able to get around is this idea, and they don't really talk about it in this book, is, well, how would you take an existing hierarchical, patriarchal organization and change it into a flat organization? And the real problem is that you're telling somebody who maybe spent their life working themselves into a position of power, first thing you have to do is give up that power that your life has been around. And I don't see that happening in an existing structure. So my initial reaction to you saying, well, let's use this, I mean, because basically you're talking about a relatively flat thing. I mean, you do have the gatekeeper who decides, or keepers who decide whether pull requests are going to be accepted or not. Right. But ultimately, everything else is, distributed and flat and not managed. And so how do you, what do you do with a manager in this situation who that's their raison d'etre?
Right.
And I think they're going to push back and say, well, my life has no meaning in your new system, so I don't like it. What do you need
me for?
Well, and I think this is the problem that we've had trying to bring Agile into organizations, because in a sense it changes the management role to something that's unfamiliar. So a
new system can be a threat to you.
Oh, a new system I think is always going to be a threat, but in particular if it's taking somebody's power away, and or having them give up their power, then that's going to be your main struggle. And I mean, I think that's why Agile has had such a hard time, and why our friend Barry has had such a tough time bringing it in, is because it's an organizational change, and it's creating a new kind of organization. That's the thing, and I think that's what you're suggesting here. And so how do you that? And I think one of the problems with Agile is that they said, here's the way you should do it, and not how do we get from here to there. That they didn't really address. And I think ultimately, it's kind of like what we talk about when we talk about changing things in languages. You're talking about a cultural change, and how do you get there? And so many things have failed because they
didn't recognize
that there's a transition necessary, and sometimes that transition can be, bloody even. So
that's super helpful for me. I need to make sure I address how do you get from here to there.
So having covered that, how do you visualize what there looks like?
The inner source utopia.
Yes, inner source utopia. That's good.
So I actually saw it at Heroku. Heroku was really good at using inner source as the way that they did software.
But my guess is that they designed the company from the ground up that way.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Yep.
Exactly.
Yeah. And it was great because I knew where the source code for everything in the whole entire system was. It was very easy to identify who the people I needed to talk with were. So the communication channels to other teams were transparent. There was just an openness for others to collaborate that you don't necessarily get in traditional models, where if I would open an issue on a project or create a pull request even, then people were excited to have an outside perspective, and so culturally, it was very different than I think most organizations. And I think you're right that culture was established up front, which made it easier it made it just this is water kind of way that things work there. Like, it would be hard to imagine things working differently. So I think your point for me is that I'm going to be talking to a traditional enterprise, and I think I need to put a lot of thinking into the transition, how the transition can happen, and really it's cultural transition.
And ultimately, is it even possible?
Is it even possible?
Is it, because you could even argue that the world wars were the transition from aristocracy to democracy and capitalism.
Yeah.
And that's why they were so bloody, is because, there were people who didn't want to lose their way of living, because it was good for them.
Yeah.
And this new system didn't have a place for them.
Yeah.
And so
I'll go to this company and say, fire all your managers, and then you can make this work.
Yeah, and that seems dumb too, because there's a lot of knowledge that they have that could be repurposed. But when even Zappos, when they changed, so they had I think the problem with that is that they didn't really have a traditional hierarchy. Zappos was already a weird company, but when they changed to Holacracy for a year, and then they decided to change to the reinventing organizations, Teal, they call it a Teal organization. When they did that, they still ended up at some point saying, okay, after we've done this, if there are people who want to leave, we'll pay you a bonus to leave. And I don't remember what it was. It was 10 or 15 or 20% of people decided that they didn't like it, which I would still, and the press made a big deal of that. But I would say, well, most companies lose that amount of people. There's a far number of large number, just attrition, just on a normal basis. So it wasn't that big of a deal. And they were left with people who really wanted to be part of this system. So it allowed that transition to happen, which I think was very smart. And so, maybe there is a way to do that and say, okay, even paying that bonus for the people who wanted to leave seems like a cost, but what is the cost of having people in your system who don't like it and who maybe are actively fighting against it? I would argue maybe a lot more. That it's hidden within the structure, so you can't easily put a number on it, whereas you can put a number on this bounty for leaving, and so people can look at it and go, oh, see, that's too expensive. But it's that measurability issue that comes up again and again.
I like the idea of identifying what are the hidden values in our current system. And I think that may be a useful tool, because I think, like you're saying, a lot of times we just don't recognize, like, here's actually what we value.
Oh, yeah, and making it explicit, I think, is really important. And to me, if you were starting an organization, to say, well, like this little consulting firm that I have, the one clear value that we have is that we want to maximize programmer happiness. And so all of the things that we do work around that. Is this making you happy or not? And like one of the things we have is there's no fixed hours. You work when you feel like working, and when you don't feel like working, you stop working. And this is from my own experience. It's like, if I try and work when I don't feel like working, I don't produce either I don't produce anything, or I don't produce anything that's particularly good. And so it's actually beneficial to stop working when you stop feeling like working. And then you don't like drag yourself through the mud and feel bad about your job, and eventually you start, it's like, oh, I'm not feeling it now, I'm going to stop, I'm going to go do something else. And that keeps people from burning out, and it keeps them engaged in their work and everything. But it's a hard sell to an organization which is built around consistency and watching over people and making sure that somehow that they're evaluating what that person is doing. When very often a manager doesn't have enough knowledge to be able to understand what somebody is doing and whether it's good or not. Only their peers actually understand that. But it's what we've always done. So we keep doing it. So,
well, that's helpful. It'll be interesting to see how this presentation goes, and because a while back there was, I think, a lot more kind of developer community energy into talking about inner source, and it kind of faded over the last few years. And I wonder if part of the reason why it faded was because people realized it was hard to like get from where they are to inner source, or maybe they didn't fully embrace that we needed to talk about transition and what was needed to make that transition or something. So I'm curious as to like why that's fade.
So what is the difference between open source and inner source? Is inner source just open source but inside a company?
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. So the structure and everything is all there. It's just that you're trying to bring in, so it really is totally a cultural change.
Yeah.
It's not, there's no technology change at all.
Yeah. Yeah.
But your argument, I suppose, would be that it's a better, more productive way of producing software?
I would say that. I would also say that that it's a better way for developers to grow, because I think oftentimes in the traditional development model, we get pretty siloed into the people that we work with and the types of problems that we solve, and we don't often often get other perspectives on how a problem could be solved, or kind of what the new thinking is around something, that kind of thing. So I'd say it helps us grow by having diversity of inputs.
So that's another interesting thing, because what pops into my head when you say that is, well, what is preventing that from happening in the traditional
system?
Source? And I would say, well, the idea of an architect, because the architect is the experience, it's the person who is granted, they say, you have the experience, you have the knowledge, so you make these decisions, and sometimes people can't question those.
Yeah.
Very often that's the case, I think.
Yeah.
And so there's another person who you're robbing of their role.
Yeah.
Is the architect, because you're saying, well, we're distributing the idea of architectural decisions as well.
Yeah. Yeah.
And anything can be questioned. And so,
yeah.
And I've seen companies where the architect has that kind of really strong control.
Ivory Tower.
Very ivory tower. Very.
I've been part of a number of architecture summits where it's all the architects get together and talk about how things should be, and then they go decree it to their people. Well,
EJB's came from an ivory tower perspective, and look how much that cost.
Yeah.
The whole world cost billions of dollars because it was not really as practical as they thought it was.
Yeah, so I could see architects feeling threatened by the idea of inner source.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah. You're going to have to put your armor on, I think.
Well, they actually asked me to come and talk about this, so I guess there is interest from them in this, and maybe they're looking for insight into how to do it. I think developer productivity is a huge benefit to inner source, because in many organizations, basically the same things get written over and over by different teams, and so being able to have a better sharing model can help increase productivity. So I think there's some really good reasons for inner source. It also, I think, helps people follow some best practices around, like, as an example, if you're doing inner source well, anybody should be able to check out your project and build it and test it. And so often in non-inner source organizations, it is impossible for some random developer to check out a project and build it and test it.
So you can't develop trust in it. And see, this is part of what's problem with an organization. Because long ago when I was, my first kind of organization job was at this company called Fluke, where we made these multimeters. And I remember that was one of the things that they wanted to do. They said, people keep writing code over and over again. But if you think about it, it's like within a small world, if you can't, how do you develop trust in a piece of code? In the big open source world, you look around and people go, oh yeah, this thing is the great thing.
Yep.
And you get this unbiased, well, it's not unbiased. I mean, they've already decided that they really like that. But you get this kind of
there's a feedback
voting system. Yeah. And it's like, oh yeah, there's all these different solutions to this problem, but this open source project is like, oh yeah, they did such a great job.
It's based on people's experience.
It's based on experience, and typically it's something you can say, oh, well, I'll just look at the GitHub repo. Oh, it's being maintained regularly.
Right.
I can check it out. I can run the tests. I have all these other people. But within a company, you could get maybe a recommendation, but it doesn't have that lots of people have tried it, that usage thing, and you go, oh yeah, that looks like that's going to save me time. You don't know that.
Yeah.
You don't know. It could be a big waste of time, and you could dig in and discover, oh, the person who wrote this did a kind of mediocre job, or maybe they didn't know what they were doing, or they didn't solve the problem you needed to solve.
Yeah.
And so, boy, yeah, I'm coming up with all these skepticisms of why open source works and inner source might not work.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I think you're right. If it's designed the way open source is, and it's like, well, here's the tests, and here's the, here's a bunch of examples of how you use it. Here's documentation, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
But in a company, it's like, well, it's working. It solves our problem. Do we need to do all the rest of that stuff?
Yeah. Are the incentives there?
Yeah, are the incentives there? Exactly.
Yeah. And but I think if it is cultural, if it's something that is culturally valued, then you do those things and then it works. But like at Heroku, it totally worked. Like projects were documented, projects were able to be checked out and built and tested by anyone. And so,
so you have an example of where it worked, which is really important.
Yeah.
But again, that example came from building the organization from the ground up around that.
I wasn't there at the beginning, but that's my.
I would guess that's the only. I mean, this is just my bias that's the only way it can work.
Yeah.
That it would be really hard to repurpose an existing company.
Well, so this company that I'm presenting to, I will have to check back with them in a year and be like, so how's it going?
And did you actually do this? Yeah.
So I think there's a lot of parallels between this and microservice architecture too, because I think that in the same way that inner source is a cultural change, microservices are a cultural change, and very much kind of the same cultural changes are needed. And I think this is why a lot of people that have tried to go to microservices have ultimately failed, is that they didn't change the culture in the right way. And so you've probably heard the term microlith, I think, is one of them. It's this idea that you've done microservices, but essentially you've just created a really complicated monolith.
Oh.
And so this happens, I think, a lot, is that people are like, yeah, microservices, let's do it. It's going to make everything better. But they don't change the culture. And so then what they get is essentially just a really complicated monolith that uses a lot of network communication, but has to all be deployed at the same time. And that's like the major litmus test of a distributed monolith or microlith or whatever it's called, is that if you have to deploy the whole thing at once, you don't really have microservices. You've just got this distributed monolith.
This reminds me of way back in the days of structured programming, where people were trying to, because they were still moving away from creating one big program. And so the idea is that, well, we're going to use functions now instead of just writing a single program. And so what I would see people do is that they would write a program that was one big function.
Yeah.
And it sounds, because it's like, oh, it didn't really get the benefits. Get the idea here.
Exactly. Whereas Netflix, they have been very successful with microservices, but I think that they had the culture for that from the beginning.
Because their culture is very, you've got this group doing this thing however they want to do it. I mean, it was already that way because they could choose different languages within one group or another. So it almost had to be microservices because there was how else do you plug those things together?
There was the system that supported it there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, whereas I think there's a lot of organizations who have this giant monolith and they're like, let's go microservices, but they don't change anything about their culture, and so it just becomes the distributed monolith.
What Gerald Weinberg said, his most famous statement, no matter what they tell you, it's always a people problem.
Yeah.
Because we want it to be a technology problem. It's like, no, but we have the technology. I mean, the same thing. Because I think part of the reason for Agile is that it's supposed to make people more productive, right? And that appeals. I want greater productivity because then we'll make more money. But I don't want to change anything else. Can we just get the greater productivity without changing anything else?
Yeah.
And so I think, that's something you're going to see.
Yeah.
Yeah, it'll be interesting.
So it sounds like you're pretty negative on the ability to change the culture in any of these ways, whether it's Agile, whether it's microservices, whether it's inner source. Like, can organizations change, or is it just futile?
Yeah, I mean, I think some of them can change. But it's so, like, we're dealing with things that are not even, like, we're dealing with patriarchy and, these hierarchical power structures and things like that. And there's a lot of, they were designed specifically to keep things the same. The traditional industrial age organization was,
at its core, is not changing.
We're going to make pencils. We're going to make a lot of pencils, and they got to be the same. So we're going to set this thing up.
Core value of the system, or a hidden value of the system, is stability.
It is. I don't even know if it's hidden. I think it was explicitly designed. We're a machine. We're going to crank these things out, and we're going to tweak things to make that a little more efficient. But the basic structure of the machine is going to stay the same, and it's a command and control structure. And so that's why I don't want to say, oh no, it's impossible, but it sure seems like everything that I look at says that, well, what you're talking about here is basically flattening an organization. Everything that I see here says, well, you're going to be, the people who are in power have a vested interest in not doing what you're suggesting.
Yeah.
That's the way it comes across. And so to me, the easy path, the happy path, is going to be saying, okay, let's start a new organization and we'll base it on these foundational principles and we'll go from there, rather than trying to take an existing organization. And one of the fascinating things about reinventing organizations is it doesn't say, oh, well, this structure and this approach is bad and the new one is right. It looks at it as an evolution. It goes, oh, well, when you were tribal, having a tribal chieftain who made decisions, that made sense. But then when the environment changed and you wanted to, do something like, we got agriculture. And so now we got a lot more people. We got to do things differently. And then this other thing arose and it worked better than that. And working better than that, I think, is the way of doing, is a better way of looking at it, because then you don't just go back and look at all those things are wrong and this is right. Just, this works better than that, and then maybe something else can come along that works better than that. But so it also allows those organizations to continue to exist as long as they're, sort of working, sort of fulfilling their need. So a hierarchical organization, we still have them. Schools are hierarchical organizations, and they sort of work. There's certainly
a lot of stability.
There's a lot of stability. There's a lot of and it sort of works. So we now see that, things probably need to be a lot better, and so maybe we need to change that structure. But for a long time, even when there was other structures coming along, it still sort of works. And it's the same with some other types of organizations. But then the new kind of organization fulfills a different need. And so I think when you're talking about inner source, you either need to have like a skunk works, but even that's a risk because somebody can always come in and go, we don't like this anymore, we're going to pull the plug on it. Or just say, here's how you would start a new organization built around inner source, because Heroku did it. Yeah. And there's probably others.
One thing I'm thinking of is how a lot of organizations over the last, let's say 5 years or so, traditional enterprise companies created centers of innovation or centers of excellence or whatever it was, I think as a way to try to, maybe they recognized that they needed to make cultural changes but couldn't do that within the traditional structure, and so they let's create this pocket of innovation. That's where the innovation happens. That's where the excellence is.
That's been going on for a while.
Those have mostly failed.
Well, right, because it's like, the scary innovation's going to happen over here, and we're going to benefit from it. And it's like, that's not really going to work, because the whole organization needs to be infused with innovative thinking, and the command and control structure does not really. I mean, even the U.S. military for a long time has been very oriented towards pushing responsibility down, which is the opposite of old, military organizations. Always, the general makes all the decisions, and no, they're always pushing down. It's like, we want the person to be, because then you can make the decision fast and based on the current situation. So that, even those guys are, those people are doing it differently because they see the benefits. But we still have a lot of this hierarchical thinking built into our organization. And hierarchical thinking means that information has to flow up and then back down, and you've got the game of telephone going on. Everybody's putting their own spin on it.
Decisions down,
and the person at the top can only get a filtered version of what's actually going on. So, there's
an efficiency in that because the CEO of a large company can't get every single piece of information. Mm-hmm. So I can see how
it's essential. It's essential that it gets filtered.
Right.
But in the process, it's like each person doing the filtering is putting their own biases on it, and so by the time it gets to the top,
making themselves look good,
and making them, yes, absolutely, making themselves look good. So there's and for a structure where the environment is relatively stable, and it's like, people are gonna, our whole lifetime, people are gonna need pencils. And so we're just going to keep making pencils. We're going to do it. We know how it works. We're going to do it this way. Any little change needs to go to the top. But then when things start changing faster and faster, and we see this in the lifetime of organizations, these big...
That's why Kodak couldn't change.
Kodak basically...
Kodak was built for stability.
Yeah, and here, what's weird about Kodak is that they basically invented the digital camera.
Yeah.
And then said, no, we're not doing that. Yeah, they were the, if I remember correctly, they were the ones who came out with the very first digital camera, and then the digital camera killed the company, basically. And it's like, and it was because there were all these people going, but we have all this investment in chemicals and stuff. We're a chemical company, so we don't do digital cameras.
Yeah.
But and that's just one example. The lifetime of companies has been shrinking. They don't last as long because, in my opinion, because they get stuck. They get designed to do one thing, and then that one thing goes away, and they can't change.
Yeah.
So it just doesn't work in a world where things are changing as fast as they are.
Yeah.
And so those companies that don't want to, for example, go and see the benefits of how open source works and somehow participate in it, whether it's inner source or maybe it's just, I mean, my hope would be that they would say, let's, if we're going to make something, let's make it an open source project. And we'll use it for our product, maybe, but it'll be an open source thing. Everybody will use it. Everybody will contribute to it. It will make the world better.
Yeah. But I think that there is beginning to be more perspective from the organizational leaders, executives, that the stability that they've built is hurting them. And so one of the buzzwords in technology right now is application modernization. How do we modernize? How do we modernize our infrastructure? How do we modernize our applications? Because they see like Airbnb come out of the blue and all of a sudden totally disrupt a whole market. And so I think they are beginning to recognize that the stability that they have is really hurting them. And so I think they're kind of grasping for, if we just get this thing, then we can solve this. And so I think that's part of...
As long as I'm still making the decisions.
That's right.
That's the problem.
That's the problem.
Yeah.
It's like, I need modernization. Well, that kind of requires that you quit or do something different. No, I don't need it that much.
Yeah, it's a really... I mean, it's taken me many years to wrap my head around how do you, because you have to think completely differently about this. Another example is Malcolm Gladwell has this podcast called Revisionist History, and he's been looking at how do we decide who we put into jobs, and he kind of goes at it. I think he uses the term nihilistic, that basically he can't know, interviews and all those things. So he just goes, this person seems nice, we'll try them. And then he goes one step further in a different podcast where he says, look at the way we elect people. How do we as voters know anything about this person, whether they're going to do a good job? And he says, well, here's a different way of doing it. Take whoever is interested in the job and use random selection and to choose the people who are going to be on this board or committee or whatever, and then have a feedback system afterwards to see if they're doing okay. And maybe somebody isn't working out and you select another person somehow, but don't assume it's this assumption that we know everything up front. That's this huge problem. And it's okay, decision made, it's done. I mean, this is one of the things that I learned with Holacracy. It was when we make a decision, we go, well, we have to make the right decision. So we spend a lot of time and effort on this, and then we're done with it. And it's so much time and effort that we never want to revisit it. And his approach was to say, well, let's reverse this. Let's make a really quick decision based on the only things we actually know, and then be willing to revisit it if it's not working. And it's that's a very, and so, but to get your head, we're just, we've been taught to do it this other way, to make sure that you don't make any mistakes. And it's well, that's not the way experimentation works. You have to make lots of mistakes, and that's where you learn from it, and then you can kind of evolve your way to a good decision.
So that's what I'll have to present is how to evolve your way to inner source.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, which is you have to do experiments, and that's the only thing that I guess I could imagine taking an existing company and changing it is that kind of experimental approach. If you have the attitude that, okay, we can do experiments and see what happens, and then evolve our way towards a better way of doing things. But again, if they had that built in already, they would have done it already. So
there is desire. So I'm not giving up hope yet.
Oh no! This could easily be something where I'm going, well, this is the way, I've done a cursory examination. It looks hopeless. I'm giving up. Whereas actually, No, I just didn't see there is a path, there is a way of getting there. It's not easy.
Like with your conferences.
Exactly, with the conferences, the conferences, the work, just organizational structures in general, but I don't know. Sometimes I get this sense of there's a solution. I can kind of smell it. It's around the corner. I can't see it. I don't know what it looks like. Versus, oh, this looks like a battle that I've got, people are going to be fighting tooth and nail, and we see evidence of it.
Yeah.
I mean, this is why Agile has not thrived, is because people are fighting that change. They did, ultimately I didn't buy into this. This is not why I joined this company, to do this thing.
Yeah.
And so they're gonna battle it, because it's not, their way of thinking. And so what you want to do is set something up where you go, here are our values. We're completely transparent about it. Our foundational principles are these things. If that doesn't agree with you, then it's not a good fit, and it up front. This isn't going to be a place that you want to play.
Yeah.
And it's like that. I'd love to see a company that is that transparent, because I have had experiences where I go in thinking that a company is a particular way, and then you get in and discover, oh, that's not how we do things here. That's just our mission statement. I mean, we had to have a mission statement, so we made one up that looked good.
Right.
But we actually do things this totally different way.
Yeah.
And so, oops, you made a mistake by joining us.
Yeah.
And wouldn't it be nice if the mission statement or the foundational principles were just out there, and you're going, I want to be part of that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. That was great.
Okay.
Thank you.
That was good. Thanks.